Hi viewers, time to tag you another episode of Tag Time. Today I have a very beautiful personality with me whose journey is a light up into the history of Canadian political system. Yes, he has been the first brown premier of British Columbia. Mr. Ujjal Dosanjh has a long political journey as those people who are courageous enough to stand for themselves and bring out to the table the differences which needs to be taken care of. With these words, I welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
While we are talking about your journey and being brought and raised up into a very contrast culture and coming to a country where entirely a different scenario is there for you, you must have been through a lot of struggle. Would you like to share about that?
Well, when you come from a place like India, a rural Punjab, where you don't speak English, you may have picked up grade 4 English in British terms or Canadian terms, and English wasn't your medium of instruction in school, and you had only done less than grade 12. Yes, it can cause a lot of hardships to come to another country. But I think that if you have an open mind, you know when you go to a different country, let alone a country, if you go to a different state in India, from one state to the other, the culture varies, the language varies, ethnic groups vary. There are a lot of differences. If you begin to accept the differences as a fact of life, and then begin to understand them, I think crossing boundaries, whether cultural or any other boundaries, becomes less of a problem, because you become accepting, you become caring, you know you're different, you know people you're looking at are different, and then differences become the commonality. There's a lot of similarities amongst human beings, but there are a lot of differences. But accepting similarities is very easy, accepting differences is more difficult. So if you go into another country, accepting differences becomes very important. That doesn't mean you should accept everything that comes your way. You have to be discerning, you have to understand, not all traditions are born equal from my perspective. That's not to say all Western traditions are great or Eastern traditions are great or less great. It's just that you have to be the judge. Like we as a society have to be the judge. So, moving from one culture to another, you need to learn language, you need to be open to different things, you need to be open to different languages. And learning a language, I can tell you from my own experience, I learned speaking English from BBC Radio. Radio BBC in those days, and I'm sure still, there's a station that has no music and no commercials. All it had was commentary, conversations, interviews, and that's how I learnt English. I would read, not understand, rarely looked at the dictionary, but when you heard the words being pronounced by people, you realized what words they were and what they meant.
So, overcoming the differences while we are doing the journey towards that, which point did you realize that there are certain things which needs to be addressed, which you thought that because I see your journey from law, from attorney general to premier to cabinet minister. So it is, what time did you decide that no, I'm going to address social issues, I have passion for them and I am the right person to do that?
Well, that I think started a long time ago. Even before I came from India, I was in grade 6 and I was asking my father why he wasn't running for elections, and I didn't realize that we didn't have money and elections needed money, and he was very sensitive and very fair-minded person who didn't want to be corrupt and didn't want to be corrupted. And so in a sense I was very conscious, and we were part of a youth group in the village. But when I came to England, I became more concerned about the inequality faced by immigrants and the difficulties faced by immigrants in integrating into the rest of society. And we set up what was called the Young Indians Association. in Bedford. That's where I first lived in England for over 2 years, and started hanging around with the Labour MP of the area, Brian Perkins, because I was concerned about the inclusion of immigrants into the political process and the equality or the inequality they experienced when they went into the political process, and whether or not they understood the political process. And so, I was very conscious most of my life, and politics was around me. I grew up in politics because of my grandfather having spent many years in the independence movement and in British jails during that time, British Indian jails, of course, and my father being a teacher and an activist, and my mother, in fact, being a very strong woman. She was the daughter of a communist, so she voted for communists, and my father was a member of the Congress Party. He voted for the Congress. So there was democracy at home. And when I came to Canada, just by the fact that I started working in a lumber mill, I was thrown into trade union movement, started hanging out with trade unionists, got involved in the Social Democratic Party called the NDP as a result, and became concerned about the inequalities faced by and the difficulties faced by domestic workers, farm workers, and janitorial workers. And that kind of made me a Canadian activist. I was already an activist, but made me into a Canadian activist about Canadian issues. And that sense of concern about the fairness and justice and inclusion that's needed in any society has never left me, and that's what kind of that was the reason I actually ran first time in 1979. I had been a rabble rouser in the sense I would speak at different stages on different issues, speak bluntly and clearly, and of course you make enemies when you do that. I'd speak against the farm contractors who cheated the farm workers, and as a result, when I was called to the bar shortly after that, once I became a lawyer, some people from the NDP, whose member I was, came to see me and wanted me to run for them, for the political party, and that's how I first ran. I didn't go seek to run myself. They came to me and asked me whether they wanted me to run because they knew of me, and that was my first election, which I lost. Then I ran another election, 1983. Lost. Then, of course, I picked a battle with the extremists in the Sikh community in the aftermath of the Golden Temple incidents, and that continued for 5 or 6 years, and didn't run for many years until 1991.
So basically, that's this book, which is Journey After Midnight, speaks about your personality, about your personal experiences of your life,
yes,
seeing the contrast and feeling it, and then explaining your political journey. So I always say that the politicians at your age are the best people to analyze and guide about things, because they have the basic knowledge and the basic information, and they have lived it through. So I am coming to the point where right now the political question, which is very much around, is again about the diversity and about how will we talk about multiculturalism and where we stand, because 5-10 years where we are evoluting towards, we are going to be more brown than anything else. So still I see a lot of lacking of communication. How do you see that?
Lacking of communications amongst
between different communities, and it's getting very big ghettoization, like people are not trying hard enough to.
Well, I think that's true, and that's happening in British Columbia, it's happening in Ontario, you tell me, and I believe it. I think that's partly the fault of politicians who make bland statements like diversity is our strength. They say it in an unqualified way, and diversity can only be our strength if we understand each other, we live with each other, not in isolation. We share our culture, we share values. We go to the neighborhood houses, we go to the neighborhood organizations, we volunteer in the same places. We may worship differently in places of our own, but that's a very small part of our lives. And what happens in this society is that somehow, because you lose the social and the cultural context of, say, Pakistan or India, religion becomes the all-important factor in your life. Whereas, for instance, in India, for me, rarely did we ever go to the temples, maybe once every 6 months. Here, every weekend, people run to the temples, because I think because they feel isolated, and then they're looking for familiarity, looking for belonging. And that is a problem, because the Canadian politicians, the Canadian public leaders, are not making the point that Canadian citizenship means that you integrate, that you become part of us, and vice versa, that you change in the ways you need to change and not change in the ways that you don't need to change. And I think Canadian politicians are afraid in some instances of speaking the truth about. I say very clearly, and I'm firmly of the view that politicians have stopped demanding of immigrants the change they need to undergo as they come to Canada. That's not to say Canada is better. That is to say Canada is different. If Canada is different and we are coming to this place, in most respects, it must be better if we're coming here.
I always put it this way, that every culture, we are binded by humanity first. And humanity means that we have a lot of common emotions, spiritual beliefs, and so many things. But the thing is, it means to bring something which is powerfully very contribution to the human system, and taking the things which you find powerful in the society also. So that is basically integration which is needed. So as a politician, what you saw predominantly the most difficult task for integration of the people?
I find the fear in the minds of the politicians is the most inhibiting factor that prevents, that stops immigrants from really integrating, because we don't ask immigrants to integrate anymore. You know, we used to be afraid of the word assimilation, legitimately so. But we are now being made afraid of the word integration as well, because some people who are cultural exclusivists think that there is parity between cultures, that if you bring the culture of genital mutilation, for instance, female genital mutilation into this country, there ought to be this cultural parity of all traditions. There can't be, there mustn't be. To really have a fair and a just and a compassionate and an egalitarian society, we have to be critical of ourselves as Canadians, but we also have to be critical of those that come into this country and say, you know, here you need to change, here we need to change. And that dialogue is not happening. What's happening is people come, and it's natural for human beings to go to places where there are people of their own kind, so to say, their own faith, their own culture, their own skin color maybe. It feels comfortable and natural. But we have to force ourselves to get out of those ghettos and go into the larger society, and the politicians have to talk about that and say, no, we can't have these ghettos. We need to interact with each other. We can't just be confined to the mosques or the gurdwaras or the churches. We have to come to the community centers.
That's what I was going to come towards. As if I have been grown in Pakistan, and I have seen that there was always two type of people there who were very religious to the extent of fundamentalist type of thing, and they were very liberal people. But when we come here, I see and I feel very sad that the only people who are politically active are considered one type of very religious, very belief. So what's your comment about that?
Well, I think what you're alluding to is that many politicians simply come to the communities and think that the religious people are the community. People who are overtly and overly religious are the community. That's not true. Most of the people are actually quite secular. They live their lives. Maybe they go to the mosque or gurdwara or church or something occasionally. Maybe they go regularly, but the rest of the time they live secular lives. And the problem with Canadian politics is that we have actually reduced different communities just to their faiths, except the Christian community. Christian Canadians, we don't reduce them to Anglicans, to United Church people, or to Baptist Church people. That's because the larger society politicians view the rest of Canada as Canada and the ethnic minorities as religious communities, not anything more. I think that's absurd from my point of view.
Don't you think that it's lack of understanding? Because diversity of, as we see human civilization, there had been always two paths. One was the spiritual as religious belief, and one was the social structure, which was done by the philosophers. And it existed from very beginning everywhere simultaneously. So what would you suggest? How come we can do something regarding that?
Well, I think the politicians have to start paying attention, less attention to religious places of worship. I don't see them going to Christian churches and asking for votes. I don't see them going to Christian churches saying, you represent these whites because they're Christians. They should do the same thing with the rest of society. I think it's not up to us. Well, it's up to us to tell them that too, but it's up to the politicians to say, we should treat everybody equally. They treat me, they look at me and they say, he's clean shaven, but he's a Sikh. I'm not a Punjabi for them. I'm not an Indian by heritage for them. And that's a matter of shame. Yeah. Shame for them, not for me.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to make them aware. But it's not my job to make politicians aware. It's the politicians' job to be aware. And the politicians in this country, many of them, are absolutely ignorant of what they're doing to the country. If you bring to the fore just the religion or the faith of the person involved, you are leaving behind 90% of what that human being is.
Yes, I agree.
And I think you're doing great injustice to us.
So, what would you like to address people who are watching you right now? They want something which you would like to give them as an advice, as a cliche, as you're finding in one sentence.
Be yourself, follow your heart and follow your dreams, but be a complete person, not be confined by the walls of faith or ethnicity or language.
Thank you very much. It's been very, very interesting talking to you.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Viewers, we are diverse because every individual is different from any other individual. We have to take it that way. Every individual has something to participate in the social system, in the society, because when we come together, we make a social system. But we all have to see all dimensions of our human beings. That's how we are complete individuals. Politics or your contribution to social system has a lot of responsibility. It needs vision and it needs a very, very deep study of how our behavior and system works. Please think over it. Don't forget to buy this book. It might help you to tell you that this country has a lot to offer, but it needs you a lot to put into it by yourself also. That's how things work. With these words, thank you very much for watching my show.
#1 multicultural channel. This is TAG TV.